What if simply doing your job could get the police called on you? What if your presence alone was considered a threat? Malcolm Hayes was just trying to earn an honest living when a single phone call turned his day into a nightmare. Accused, judged, and surrounded by flashing lights. Would the truth even matter? But this time, karma had other plans. Watch the shocking moment that changed everything. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more eye-opening stories. The mid-morning sun hung high over Charleston, South Carolina, casting golden rays across Cedar Oak Lane, a historic and well-manicured neighborhood known for its pristine lawns and neatly trimmed hedges. The scent of freshly cut grass mingled with the salty breeze drifting in from the nearby harbor. It was the kind of place where the biggest disturbances usually came from the occasional barking dog or a late-night delivery truck. Malcolm Hayes wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand, momentarily pausing his work. The 35-year-old black man, lean and muscular from years of manual labor, had spent the last hour tending to the front yard of a charming two-story colonial-style home, owned by Henry Caldwell. Henry was an 82-year-old retired military veteran who had lived in this house for over 4 decades. He was a man of routine, discipline, and pride, especially when it came to his home. But ever since his knee surgery 2 months ago, yard work had become impossible. That's where Malcolm came in. For the past few years, Malcolm had built a strong reputation as a professional landscaper, one of the best in town. He was known for his work ethic, fair prices, and no-nonsense attitude. His clients trusted him with their properties, recommended him to their friends, and never once had to question his integrity. The day's job was a simple one: trim the hedges, mow the lawn, clear out dead leaves, and refresh the flower beds. A solid 4-hour job, maybe 5 if the humidity slowed him down. Malcolm liked working in neighborhoods like this, quiet, clean, predictable. But predictability didn't mean acceptance. Across the street, Margaret Whitmore stood on her porch, arms crossed over her chest, her sharp eyes locked on Malcolm. She was the kind of woman who made it her mission to know everything happening on the block, whose car belonged where, who came and went, and most importantly, who belonged. 50 years old, prim and proper, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had appointed herself the unofficial watchdog of Cedar Oak Lane. Malcolm had seen her before, never spoken to her, but he knew the type. The kind who watched but never greeted, who eyed him as though he was out of place, despite being hired to work there. He exhaled slowly and turned back to his work. He dealt with people like her before, but something about the way she didn't look away made his muscles tense. The steady hum of Malcolm's lawnmower filled the air, blending with the soft rustle of the wind through the old oak trees that lined Cedar Oak Lane. The sun had risen higher now, casting sharp shadows along the pavement. Sweat trickled down the side of his face, but he ignored it, his focus trained on the neat rows he was creating in Henry Caldwell's front yard. It was a peaceful morning, or at least it should have been. Malcolm was no stranger to the unspoken rules of neighborhoods like this. He had worked in plenty of wealthy, predominantly white areas before, where the sight of a black man doing honest work still somehow made people uneasy. He had gotten used to the glances, the wary looks, the careful distance people kept. But today, something felt different. The feeling of being watched had been gnawing at him since he arrived, and he knew exactly who it was. Across the street, Margaret Whitmore stood motionless on her porch, arms crossed so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She wasn't pretending to look elsewhere. She wasn't even trying to be subtle. Malcolm exhaled through his nose, gripping the handle of the mower just a little tighter. Don't engage, just do the job. He moved on to the hedges, switching to the trimmer, carefully shaping the bushes along the front walkway. He forced himself to keep his eyes trained on his work. But then, movement. From the corner of his eye, he saw her lift her phone. His fingers tensed around the handle of the trimmer. Was she taking pictures? Recording? Malcolm straightened up slightly, tilting his head just enough to get a better view. She was pointing the phone directly at him. A familiar frustration burned in his chest, but he didn't let it show. He had seen this before. Margaret stood there for a few more seconds, then abruptly turned and walked back inside. Malcolm let out a slow breath, rolling his shoulders. Maybe that was it. Maybe she had satisfied whatever paranoid fantasy she had built up in her mind. But 2 minutes later, she came back out. This time, she was on the phone. She wasn't standing still anymore. She was pacing. Her movements were sharp, agitated. She was gesturing with her free hand, talking fast, too fast for Malcolm to hear, but he knew what this looked like. His stomach tightened. He had been in this situation before, but it never got easier. Malcolm checked his watch. He had only been here for 45 minutes. It didn't matter. The moment she took that call, he knew exactly what was coming next. The sharp wail of sirens cut through the quiet streets of Cedar Oak Lane, shattering the peaceful hum of the neighborhood. The sound grew louder, echoing off the neatly lined houses, until 2 black and white police cruisers rounded the corner, their red and blue lights flashing against the sunlit pavement. Malcolm's chest tightened. This was happening. He kept his hands at his sides, resisting the urge to clench them. Stay calm. Keep your voice steady. Don't give them a reason. The first squad car pulled up sharply to the curb, followed closely by the second. The doors swung open simultaneously and 2 officers stepped out. The first, Officer Bradley, was a man in his mid-40s, white, with a square jaw and a look that was already filled with suspicion. His hand rested on his gun belt, not drawing but ready. Assessing. Calculating. The second, Officer Reed, looked younger, maybe early 30s, black, with a more neutral expression. He wasn't as tense as Bradley, but Malcolm could tell he was still watching, still evaluating. Then, like clockwork, Margaret Whitmore made her entrance. She stepped down from her porch like a woman with purpose, phone still in hand, her posture stiff with self-righteous indignation. "There he is," she declared, pointing directly at Malcolm. "He doesn't belong here." Bradley turned to her first. "Ma'am, did you place the call?" "Yes. I told dispatch there was a suspicious man loitering around. He was looking around too much, acting strange, like he was casing the house." Her voice was sharp, filled with certainty, as though she had just saved the neighborhood from an impending crime. Malcolm closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again. He knew exactly where this was going. Bradley turned to him, his eyes cold, unreadable. "You mind telling me what you're doing here?" Malcolm inhaled slowly, keeping his voice even. "I'm working. Landscaping. Hired by the homeowner." Reed's gaze flicked to the tools, the neatly trimmed hedges, the mower, the piles of bagged leaves. There was nothing suspicious about the scene, it spoke for itself. But Bradley wasn't satisfied. Margaret wasn't done either. "I don't care what he says," she snapped. "He was acting suspicious. He doesn't live here and I've never seen him before." Bradley looked back at Malcolm, giving him a long, slow assessment. Then came the words Malcolm knew were coming. "Do you have ID?" A muscle in Malcolm's jaw twitched. His license was in his truck just a few steps away, but he had to be careful. He had to move the right way. No sudden movements, no quick gestures. "It's in my truck," Malcolm said slowly, nodding in its direction. "Can I get it?" Bradley's grip tightened on his belt. Even Reed's shoulders squared slightly. "Go ahead." Slowly. Malcolm turned deliberately, each movement measured, his hands visible the entire time. He reached the driver's side door, opened it, and retrieved his wallet. Then, with the same deliberate slowness, he pulled out his license and turned back toward the officers. Bradley snatched it from his hand, his eyes flicking over the details. The silence was thick, stretching between them like an invisible thread. Then, the sound of a door opening. Malcolm's gaze shifted past the officers toward Henry Caldwell's house. The old man had finally stepped outside, and his face was pure rage. The sound of a door creaking open cut through the tense silence, drawing everyone's attention toward the Caldwell residence. Henry Caldwell, 82 years old but still standing tall, leaned on his cane as he stepped onto his front porch. His face was dark with anger, eyes sharp beneath his silver brows. Malcolm had never seen the old man this furious before. Henry's voice was rough, commanding, honed from years of military service. "What the hell is going on?" His sharp gaze swept across the scene. 2 squad cars, flashing lights, 2 officers, and Malcolm standing still as stone. Then his eyes landed on Margaret Whitmore, who was still holding her phone, looking both indignant and slightly nervous. Officer Bradley turned, his stance still firm, though there was a flicker of uncertainty in his posture now. "Sir," he said, clearing his throat, "do you know this man?" Henry's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Of course I do," he snapped. "I hired him." A heavy silence fell over the group. Bradley exchanged a glance with Reed, but before either of them could respond, Margaret's voice cut through the air like a blade. "That doesn't mean anything," she snapped, her face flushed. "He could still be a thief. Maybe he tricked you, maybe he's been scoping out the place for weeks." Henry let out a sharp, bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Lady, he's been working for me for 3 damn years." His tone was filled with disdain. Margaret flinched but wasn't ready to back down yet. "I was just looking out for the neighborhood," she insisted, her voice tight, defensive. Malcolm, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. His voice was calm, controlled, but there was an undeniable weight behind his words. "Do I look like someone, or is it just because I'm black?" The words hung in the air, thick and heavy. Margaret froze as if someone had dumped ice water down her back. Officer Reed shifted slightly, looking between Margaret and Malcolm, his expression unreadable. Bradley's jaw tightened, but he didn't say anything. Margaret opened her mouth like she wanted to fire back, but this time no words came out, because there was nothing left to say. The tension was suffocating, an unspoken truth filling the space between them. They all knew what this was. Bradley cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the situation. "Sir," he addressed Henry again, his voice stiff. "We received a call about a suspicious person. We were just following up." Henry scoffed. "Suspicious? Because he was doing his damn job." Margaret's hands curled into fists at her sides, her lips pressing into a thin line. I just," she stammered. "You just what?" Henry cut in. "Didn't think a black man belonged in this neighborhood. Thought you'd play hero and call the cops." Margaret took a step back, her confidence visibly cracking. Malcolm didn't move, didn't change his expression, but he felt it, the shift in power. For once, someone like Margaret was the one struggling to find the right words. And Malcolm wasn't about to help her. The silence that followed Henry's words was thick and suffocating. The weight of reality crashed down on Margaret Whitmore, her normally composed demeanor cracking right in front of everyone. Her mouth opened, then closed, her lips pressed into a tight, pale line. The smug certainty she had carried moments ago was nowhere to be found. And then a voice cut through the air like a blade. "Oh, don't worry, Margaret." The voice was steady, confident, and unmistakably amused. "I recorded everything." Heads turned toward the sidewalk. Standing just beyond the curb, Emily Rogers held up her phone, her camera still recording. The light on the screen glowed, showing a live feed of everything that had just unfolded. Her stance was casual, but her eyes were sharp. Margaret whirled around, her entire body stiffening as though she had been struck. You can't post that," she sputtered, her voice breaking under the weight of her rising panic. Emily raised an eyebrow, tilting her phone slightly. "Why not?" Officer Bradley shifted uncomfortably, clearing his throat. For the first time since he arrived, his confidence wavered. Officer Reed stayed silent, his eyes locked on Margaret, but his stance had subtly changed, less defensive, more observational. Margaret's fingers clawed at the air in frustration. "She's violating my privacy. You have to do something," she demanded, turning toward Bradley as if expecting backup. Emily let out a small, dry laugh, her lips curling in amusement. "Funny, because what you just did to Malcolm, that's harassment." Margaret's face contorted, her body tightening as if she had been cornered. Henry Caldwell, who had been standing silent, let out a long, slow breath. Then he took a step forward, gripping his cane tighter. Everyone froze. Henry was 82 years old, but his presence alone commanded authority. His sharp, steel-gray eyes locked onto Margaret, and in that moment she looked small. "You know what, Margaret?" he said, his voice low, deliberate, and filled with quiet rage. "You could have gotten this man killed today." Margaret snapped her head up, her eyes wide. "Oh, come on, that's dramatic," she scoffed, but her voice was losing strength. Henry didn't even blink, his voice never wavered. "No, it's not." A slow, crushing silence settled in. The truth hung in the air, undeniable and heavy. Then the final blow. Henry turned toward Malcolm, his expression unreadable. Then he turned back to Margaret and spoke, his tone calm but deadly serious. "We're suing her." Margaret staggered backward, her breath catching in her throat. You can't," she sputtered, but her voice had lost all authority. Henry snorted. "Watch me." Margaret stood frozen, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. She had lost control of the situation completely. Emily's phone remained raised, the screen still glowing, capturing everything. In that moment, Margaret Whitmore's world began to collapse around her. The video spread like wildfire. Within hours, Emily Rogers' footage had been shared tens of thousands of times, circulating across social media platforms. By the next morning, it had over 1 million views, with countless comments condemning Margaret Whitmore's actions. News outlets picked up the story. People were furious. They dissected every frame, pointing out the clear racial bias, the false accusations, and how quickly the police had escalated the situation. But the real storm hit when people started digging. Margaret's history wasn't clean. Residents of Cedar Oak Lane came forward, sharing stories of her frequent 911 calls, a black teenager delivering newspapers, a Hispanic man fixing a neighbor's plumbing, even a black father playing with his daughter at the park. Her pattern of false reports was undeniable. Then came the professional consequences. By the end of the week, her employer released a statement condemning her behavior, claiming they were reviewing her conduct. By Monday, she was fired. And then came the real consequences. Margaret's neighbors turned against her. People who once greeted her warmly now avoided eye contact. Parents at the local school whispered about her. Her once pristine reputation was destroyed overnight. Then came the lawsuit. Henry Caldwell, true to his word, took legal action. He sued Margaret for harassment and defamation, ensuring that her actions had lasting consequences. It wasn't about money, it was about making a statement. Margaret tried to fight back. She ranted in private Facebook groups, tried to justify herself, even claimed she was the victim of a witch hunt. But she was losing more than just the case. Her entire life unraveled, and then she cracked. One evening, Malcolm's phone buzzed with an unknown number. He debated ignoring it but decided to check. A long message appeared. "Margaret, please, Malcolm, I need to talk to you. I'm receiving threats. I lost my job. My kids won't talk to me. I can't even go outside without people harassing me. Please, I never meant for it to go this far." Malcolm stared at the screen. It wasn't an apology. She wasn't sorry for what she did, she was sorry for what had happened to her. He exhaled, then typed a simple response. "Malcolm, not my problem." Then he blocked the number. The world moved on. The next time Malcolm pulled into Henry Caldwell's driveway, the porch across the street was empty. Margaret's curtains were drawn, her once pristine yard left untended. She had spent years watching over the neighborhood, passing judgment on who belonged and who didn't. And now she was invisible. For the first time in a long time, Malcolm could work in peace.